I continue to read the biography of Isaiah Berlin, Chapter 13, Cold War. The middle ground became more tenuous, still with the publication of Berlin's panegyric to Churchill in 1949. Winston Churchill in 1940 is deservedly famous as one of the asses that created the Churchillian myth. It was a brilliant examination, both ironic and admiring, of the structure of a Churchillian rhetoric, how archaic and baroque prose style was self-consciously forged in order to align the Churchillian persona with the grand sweep of English history, and how his speeches created the flattering mirror of a myth in which the English people could see their best features heroically enhanced. Since Isaiah's own emerging prose style was self-consciously archaic, a superbly personal pastiche of the rolling periods of the Macaulay and Carlyle, his remarks on the rhetoric of archaic ponderousness as a form of psychological defense mechanism can be read autobiographically. Since we think largely in words, he remarks at one point, they necessarily take on the property of serving as armor. Since his own writing triggered understandable anxieties about commitment, self-disclosure, and inauthenticity, he was fascinated by Churchill's armor, by his artistic ability to create adamantine moral conviction in the face of chaos without and darkness within. It was the intensity of Isaiah's own identification with the Churchillian project of creating a believable rhetoric that raised the article above political hagiography. But hagiography is what his left-wing friends took it to be. Half of the country had voted Churchill out of office in 1945 and regarded him as a reactionary relic. In 1949, an election beckoned. Churchill was about to lead the conservative attack on the Attlee record, and here was a supposed liberal singing his praises as the largest human being of our time. Harold Laski, the leading intellectual within the Labour Party, wrote 2 angry letters attacking Isaiah for failing to mention Churchill's lack of magnanimity, his power to be meanly aggressive, his long-term capacity for revenge, and his coarse and often malignant brutality. Isaiah did not pay much heed to this. He regarded Lasky as a myth-making mediocrity. But it was less easy to be rebuked by his old friend Rach Milevich. It did not matter that Rach was now entering a twilight of depression and mental illness from which he never recovered. On this occasion, he was stingingly accurate. Quote, "It is not the business of a member of the Labour Party to write an objective account about the role of Churchill. It is, after all, not an obituary. It is a heroization of the still alive and acting Churchill, appearing 2 months before the election." End quote. Rach Milevich's mistake was to assume that his old friend was a Labour supporter. While Berlin had voted for Labour in the landslide of 1945, he had a good reason to loathe Labour for their stubborn refusal to grant a Jewish state in Palestine, and was never comfortable with the mixture of a minor public school morality, Methodist unction, and technocratic busyboding, which served as the wild springs of labor activism. Compared to this, Churchill seemed both grand and life-enhancing. Isaiah particularly enjoyed a Churchillian remark reported to him by his friend John Sparrow. When John Sparrow had murdered conversation in some abstruse academic complexity, the great man had cut him short. "Do not darken counsel, young man." Churchill's own reaction to Berlin's fulsome praise took some time in coming. William Deakin laid it on his desk and waited for Churchill to make a comment. Finally, getting none, he prompted Churchill, and the old man winked and growled. "Too good to be true." Berlin and Churchill met in December 1949 at Oliver Littleton's house. But then the Irving Berlin story had entered political lore, and Churchill bowed his head and said that Mr. Berlin must be aware of the solecism he had been so unfortunate to commit in his regard. Churchill was then absorbed in his own painting, and he strolled from room to room, peering at every picture, commenting loudly on the technique and the brush strokes, while an eddy of dinner guests followed nervously behind. At the dinner table, he made a remark that Isaiah reported to Vera Weizmann with obvious approval. "Never mind whether the choices are good or bad. What we must have is a great multiplicity of them, and not a miserable gray on gray." End quote. Since only too evidently Labour was the miserable gray on gray, Isaiah's vote on this in the election of 1950 ought to have been a foregone conclusion. In fact, he admired Churchill but never actually liked him. At the same dinner, the old line rode that he was looking forward to returning to power and pitching into the fight with Stalin with real ferocity. He said he thought both Italy and France might fall to the communists, and he contemplated the possibility of a renewed war in Europe with obvious delight. Berlin was both enthralled and repelled. He was too coarse, too brutal, and I didn't want him back in. So he voted for the Liberals instead. In convictions, he was a liberal social democrat, but he was more comfortable socially among conservatives. He tried to have it both ways, and inevitably, this opened him to charges of being two-faced. But here too, he was a fox who longed to be a hedgehog. What he admired about Churchill, after all, was his adamantine firmness of purpose and hedgehog-like consistency. But how could a liberal outside hope to be a hedgehog? After this dinner tension, this drive to find a core of a belief, even if it stood betwixt and between, came Berlin's longest and most significant essay to date, Political Ideas in the 20th Century. published in Foreign Affairs in the spring of 1950. The essay can be read as a Cold War text, as a Western liberals' defense of freedom against the Soviet threat. But it made more comfortable reading them that both Soviet Marxism and the post-war Western social democracy were prey to the same 20th century rationalist illusion. That with a sufficient social engineering, human evils could be abolished and individuals happily assimilated into the seamless social consensus. To be sure, Soviet Marxism was more ruthless in its contempt for democracy and human rights. But the Western liberals could not remain complacent. The human desire to be relieved of the burden of a choice might lead the West to hand the dilemma of a public and private life over to experts, politicians, psychotherapists, and other engineers of human souls. In anticipation of what Daniel Bell was to call the end of ideology, Isaiah observed that the fundamental disagreement about the political and moral ends had been displaced by a technical disagreement about the means. This technocratic style of politics displaced the moral disagreement. It did not resolve it. In fact, beneath a blind managerial consensus, ardently opposed principles continued to contend. Having condemned modernity for bland managerial consensus, Berlin now, rather contradictorily, criticized its shrill polarization. Liberals, he said, with a taste for private life and a distaste for organized political movements, were dispersed by all the embattled parties in the great ideological wars of our time. In these wars, Isaiah belonged on the liberal left, but he warned his own side that their goals were in conflict. For every supposed gain in social justice, there might be a corresponding loss of freedom. This conflict between ends was bound to defy smooth managerial solution. The best that could be hoped for was some logically untidy, flexible, and even ambiguous compromise. What the age calls for, Isaiah concluded, is not, as we are often told, more faith, or stronger leadership, or more scientific organization. Rather, it is the opposite, less messianic order, more enlightened skepticism. But men do not live only by fighting evils. They live by choosing their own goals, a vast variety of them, seldom predictable, at times incompatible. It was individual freedom to choose well or ill, which had to be defended, not some ultimate vision of the human good. Since no disposition was faultless, no disposition was final. His motto in politics, he concluded, was "C'est tout par trop de zèle." The left's reaction was predictable. E. H. Carr, writing later in the Times, remarked that a thinker who warned against the dangers of a strong belief was unlikely to believe anything very much at all. The reaction on the center-right was more enthusiastic. The powerful publisher of Time magazine, Henry R. Luce, and the editor of the Washington Post, Herbert Alliston, wrote to congratulate Berlin on his foreign affairs article. But both wished there had been a more ringing expression of faith in Western democracy. When Alliston wrote to ask him to pen a credo for Cold War liberals, Isaiah replied ironically, quote, "Certainly I do not think that the answer to communism is a counter-faith, equally fervent, militant, etc., because one must fight the devil with the devil's weapons. To begin with, nothing is less likely to create a faith than perpetual reiteration of the fact that we are looking for one, must find one, are lost without one, etc., etc." End quote. Other friends, like the Russian emigre composer Nicholas Nabokov, believed in militant cultural crusade against the communist threat. And when the American Central Intelligence Agency began funding the Congress of Cultural Freedom, Nabokov became its secretary in Paris. The Congress activities included the covert funding of Encounter magazine, founded in 1953 by Stefan Spender and Irving Kristol. Tempo Presente in Italy, edited by Niccolo Chiaramonte, Préverse in Paris, and Der Monat in Germany. Berlin certainly knew all the major figures in these Cold War publications, as well as people like Mikhail Josephson, who were active agents of the CIA in Europe. He also had no difficulty, then or later, in thinking of himself as a Cold War intellectual. But he certainly had no official or unofficial relationship with either British intelligence or the CIA. And he had no foreknowledge that the CIA was covertly funding the magazines to which he contributed, though he may have heard rumors and may have had his suspicions. As he later explained, "I did not in the slightest object to American sources supplying the money. I was pro-American and anti-Soviet, and if the source had been declared, I would not have minded in the least. What I and others like me minded very much was that a periodical which claimed to be independent over and over again turned out to be in the pay of American secret intelligence." But this did not become public knowledge until 1967. Until then, Berlin contributed to Encounter, but it would be far-fetched to regard the studies of the Russian intelligentsia, which he published there between 1954 and 1956, as blows in the ideological struggle. Nor were his foreign affairs articles simply pieces of Cold War propaganda. They were serious attempts to understand the totalitarian temptation in the 20th century as a whole, and while they gained in wide and influential readership, some of his more engaged friends, like Charles Bauchler, felt they failed to denounce the evils of communism with sufficient energy. George Kennan, the architect and philosopher of America's post-war policy of containment towards the Soviet Union, praised the political ideas in the 20th century as one of the really important statements about our own times, but felt the concluding condemnation of the Soviet Union was too perfunctory. He observed correctly that what Berlin loathed about fascism and communism was their moral cynicism, their shared contempt for ordinary human beings. Both had sought to indoctrinate men into abandoning their faith in their own judgment. Kennan's letter drew from Berlin one of his most thoughtful expressions of his convictions. He agreed with Kennan that at the core of his moral outlook lay in a fierce dislike of attempts to deny human beings their right to moral sovereignty. Communism and fascism alike were guilty of this in the very way they sought to indoctrinate their adherents and liquidate their enemies. He dealt at length on the most somber example, how Nazi executioners had deceived the Jews into peacefully going to their death by reassuring them that the cattle cars were taking them towards resettlement in the East. Quote, "Why does this deception, which may in fact have diminished the anguish of the victims, arouse a really unuttered kind of horror in us? Surely because we cannot hear the thought of human beings denied their last rights, of knowing the truth, of acting with at least the freedom of the condemned, of being able to face their destruction with fear or courage, according to their temperaments, but at least as human beings, armed with the power of a choice." End quote. There was, he came to see, a continuum of denials of the human right to know one's fate, and they could lead, he now saw, to the gas chamber. The Holocaust was not solely responsible for fixing this theme at the center of his thought thereafter. A confluence of pressures put it there. Rising moral distaste for the Marxist theory of false consciousness and the souled engineers of human souls. But anti-communist conviction alone was insufficient to account for the vehemence, consistency, and determination with which he defended the embattled sovereignty of a private judgment and the right of human beings to know their fate and meet it with their eyes open. Here, Auschwitz did play a subliminal part. It was the thought of his own people, indecently deceived, going blindly to their death, which turned a theme into a conviction, an idea into a commitment. The fox had discovered that he was a hedgehog after all. He had found the one big thing that was to order his intellectual life thereafter, the theme of freedom and its betrayal. In 1950 and 1951, he read furiously the works of the philosophers, Diderot, Helvetius, Hollerbach, Le Mature, Voltaire. He also began, for the first time, reading German Romanticisms, Schelling, Herder, Fichte. In February and March 1952, he gave the Mary Flexner lectures on political ideas and in the Romantic Age at Bryn Mawr College in Pennsylvania. Here, for the first time, he began to assemble his historical vision of the transition between Enlightenment and the Romantic ideals and of freedom. The Enlightenment philosophies, he told the Bryn Mawr undergraduates, assumed that the human values could be derived from the facts about human nature. They believed that all men wanted the same things and that these things were not in conflict. The entire Western agenda of the ameliorative reform derived from this optimistic rationalism. Berlin's dilemma was how to rescue what was a positive in the Enlightenment projects from what was a tyrannous. What was a positive was clear enough. The attack on religious authority and dogma, the campaign for human rights and personal freedom against state tyranny, the faith in human reason itself. In these respects, Isaiah himself was a Voltairean to the core. He could see, however, that Enlightenment rationalism was deeply flawed. Human values could not be securely derived from human nature. This was what the Romantic thinkers had understood. Values were created by men in their struggle to master themselves, their society, and the natural world. Values, therefore, were historical, relative to the cultures that engendered them, and contradictory, since human nature itself was contradictory.